It's time to find out how it's doing. National parks. What comes to mind when you hear those words? Do you imagine wild places, ancient places, where life renews itself with unquenchable vigor and beauty? Most Canadians do. Our parks seem to stand for Canada, this vast northern wilderness where nature has room to be free. But is this still true? This was the dream of the national park. The sublime landscape within reach of the tourist. A civilized island within the vast impenetrable wilderness that once filled the country. A place to get away from ordinary life into the wild blue yonder. But these days, this postcard view is just a marketing tool. The reality is often very different. Many of our best-known parks are under siege. Battered remnants of the wild in a desert of human settlement. It's an invading army. 14 million people visited national parks last year, and the inhabitants are losing ground. Parks were founded to preserve the wilderness for Canadians to enjoy forever. But that may be a deadly contradiction. This army shoots pictures, not bullets. Most people visit national parks to make contact with nature. But are they and the roads and services they use destroying the wilderness they come to enjoy?
Babies especially are so afraid.
According to the National Parks Act, parks must be maintained unimpaired for future generations. Where there's a conflict, protecting nature comes first. But how well is that law enforced? Should there be better protection or more recreation? It depends on what you think national parks are for.
Just wilderness as it used to be hundreds of years ago, just a picture of the past and something that we can look forward to for the future.
Number one is to keep it in the natural environment, and we want to respect the animals, the grizzlies, the coyotes, everything that's in danger. I think it's very important to keep a special place for them.
You got to develop as the population demands it, you know. You can't keep people out of the parks. It's why, they're here, the land's here for us to use.
The Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society is an advocate for the wild. Harvey Locke.
National parks exist to protect aspects of wild nature and to enable people who want to experience wild nature to see it in its pure form and to learn about it. That's the purpose of national parks.
The Association for Mountain Parks Protection and Enjoyment thinks national parks have other priorities too. Dave Day.
This is a significant part of Alberta's tourism industry. Perhaps as much as $1 billion in direct tourism expenditures every year are made in the mountain parks and in the areas around the mountain parks, and they contribute over $200 million in taxes to Canada.
When recreation on the Moline River near Jasper disturbed the nesting habitat of harlequin ducks, Parks Canada decided to close the area during May and June each year. Rafting operators sued for lost revenues, arguing people come first.
It's a very environmentally safe and sound thing that 20,000 people, approximately 20,000 people apparently enjoy. Vis-a-vis, we're talking between 5 to 18 ducks.
There's so few, perhaps they need extra protection. After all, this is a park. Who does come first in a national park? Dave Day.
Many people will say, well, these parks are for elk, and I say, no, they're not. A nature reserve is for elk, but a park is for people and elk. And that's where I think the debate rages, if you want. That's where the research has to focus.
Biologist Paul Paquette has worked in the park for 8 years.
For the most part, Canadians are ignorant as to what's occurring in national parks. Most assume that parks are here for the protection of both space and the animals and various species which are contained in those parks, and that's just not the case. The priority to date has been economic development and exploitation of the parks for profit.
Let's begin where it all began, in the fierce wild beauty of the Rocky Mountains. Banff National Park was created in 1885, the first park in Canada, just the third in the whole world. At its heart is the town of Banff and the legacy of a century of tourism. Hotels, motels, a convention center, 650 businesses. It's hard to believe this busy shopping center is in a national park. Parks management policies were first developed here, and this is what they produced. For some people, it's a tragedy. Harvey Locke.
I go back to before there was a park. My great-grandfather actually cut rails for the CPR main line that went through the park. My grandmother told me a story of the house she lived in on Martin Street, where one night she was walking home as a girl and there were 3 moose ran down the street and scared her off the road. Well, right now there's a big parkade that's part of a 3-story mall that calls itself Banff's Great Indoors opposite that house. And there are no moose on Martin Street, nor are there any bears on Bear Street or wolves on Wolf Street.
In the last decade, almost $500 million worth of building permits have been granted. For local business people, this growth is simply progress. Ozzie Treutler.
Let's talk about the town of Banff and about Banff National Park. These are two entirely different problems. The naturalists like to mix it up, so every time and I resent that. Banff has grown from within. But again, I get back to it's a renovation job. We are not using new raw land that you would use in the development somewhere else in the city or a town, anywhere else in Canada. We are renewing existing structures. That's all we are doing within an established boundary, a boundary established by Act of Parliament.
For Dave Day, it's a success story.
Today we have one of Canada's major international tourism destinations, both for visitors from other countries and Canada. We enjoy 3.5 million legitimate park visitors just here in Banff and another 1.5 million in Jasper. Those 5 million visitors every year demonstrate that in spite of the challenges and in spite of the problems, this remains a beautiful place to visit and a place people want to visit.
In the town and in the park, these development projects are approved according to park regulations, but their accumulated impact on the wilderness is enormous.
We've done a very, very bad job of managing this park. And what we've done is we've turned it into a place for other purposes. And what we've done is eroded both the aspect of protecting wildlife and ecosystems, and we've eroded the quality of experience for people who come to experience nature on their own terms in parks. In a sense, it's been perverted down a path of commercialism. And the consequences of that are both disastrous ecologically and disastrous aesthetically as well as spiritually.
Charlie Zinken is the superintendent of Banff National Park.
You know, the vast majority of Canadians think that parks are for wilderness. I think they would be shocked if they were to come here and see how much development has taken place.
Well, we're just in the process of trying to obtain public input into the management plan and the future of this park at this time. I think what we have to have is a consensus in society as to what is appropriate in this national park and all our national parks. I think when you look at what you see in Banff National Park, it is not a result of decisions necessarily today or even yesterday or 10 years ago. We're talking about a park that has evolved over 100 years when our understanding of issues and priorities may have been very different.
Well, I don't know if it's a consensus, but an Angus Reid poll says that over 2 out of every 3 Canadians believe parks should be for wilderness. That's a pretty strong statement.
And the National Parks Act establishes the bottom line of a protected environment as being the objective of national parks. But that's not to say that visitation and people are also not a part of the scenario here.
This game is called Banffopoly. It's about property and profit inside Canada's oldest national park. Let me introduce you to the players. This is a caretaker of the park. Her bosses answer to an elected minister. This is the environmentalist. He wants to protect the natural values of the park. This is a tourist, using and enjoying the park in all kinds of different ways. And this is a businessman, anxious to provide services wherever there's a profit to be made. They've all been players in one way or another since the park began. Whose turn is it right now? Problem is, the crucial players aren't at the table. The residents, the community of life that's been evolving here for 10,000 years or more. Whoever else has won, they've been losing steadily over the past century. And recently, they've found their place has been sold out from under them. This is their place, the montane regions of the park, the land at the bottom of the valleys. Life in the mountains depends on the montane for food and shelter. It's critical wildlife habitat. Spring comes earlier down here in the Bow Valley. These chicks were hatched before winter loosened its grip on the mountains. In the brief northern summer, timing is the key to survival. Every calendar is set to catch the moment before it vanishes. Warblers fly in for the first insect bloom, energy to raise a family in a hurry. Early in the year, marsh grasses provide rich browsing and furnish nests for muskrat and loon. Less than 3% of Banff National Park is montane land, prime feeding grounds and travel corridors for wildlife. The trouble is, human beings want the best land too, and so they've taken it. The Trans-Canada Railway crosses the mountains through the Bow Valley. So does the Trans-Canada Highway. Roads, parking lots, the township, hotels, camping grounds. Human activities spread through the valleys, taking over the montane. Visitors can't see the effect they're having because it happens over time, but the animals are disappearing. This is now a rare sight. Moose were numerous here 30 years ago. Today, they're in severe decline in the Bow Valley. Wolves were eradicated here to leave the park for human hunters. Trying to come back, they find their place occupied and even more dangerous than before. Instead of shooting wolves, as parks policy used to be, today's park wardens are scraping them off the highway and the railway. Warden Mike Gibault is looking at the state of carnivores in Banff National Park.
Much of the research we've done to this point is theoretical. We haven't studied grizzly bears in depth here. We have just now started to study wolves with some detail, and we're speculating as to what has gone on in the past, but the trends show that the populations of most large carnivores are on the decline. Each individual species reacts somewhat differently to the problems, but the problem is too many people.
Point at the brown rock, you'll see a brown mass.
Yeah?
Okay, that's it.
Yes, leave in the trees. Yeah, that's it. You're not going to the right place. He's moving along.
Spotting a grizzly is the high point of a trip to Banff. But these days, visitors are often disappointed. This is bear number 16, the only grizzly in the lower Bow Valley in the summer of '94. Biologist Paul Paquette.
People have a great misunderstanding of what is actually happening here. They may come into the valley and still see grizzly bears. And of course they assume I see a grizzly bear, so things are fine. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that the population is going to survive over the long term. Those can be solitary animals, and the last of the solitary animals who are still able to use this area and exploit it. So my guess is we will not see grizzly bears in the long-term future.
How have things gone so badly wrong?
One of the major reasons, in my opinion, that we've seen such a radical change in the ecology of this national park is that parks have failed to implement their own policies. And those policies clearly state that they are to maintain into perpetuity and essentially preserve what is here for future generations. And that has not been done. That's been a failure. And it's been an ongoing failure. Other concerns and other values have been placed above those values of preservation.
When we come back, park wardens set the forest on fire.
I never used a nasal spray before.
Otravin.
Scotland, a country whose rugged beauty has always bred strength of character and trustworthy counsel. No surprise, it also gave birth to Standard Life, Canada's only major financial institution to have earned Moody's and Standard & Poor's AAA rating. Such are the rewards of exceptional discipline, financial stability, and performance. Standard Life.
If a department store offered you their best savings on only 3 outfits, would you shop there?
As you can see, we have a fabulous selection.
Is this it? Only 3 things?
If a car dealer offered you his best savings on only 3 cars, would you be happy?
3 cars?
Take all the time you want. And if a video store offered you their best savings on only 3 movies, would you come back? So why are you with the other guy? Sure, they offer savings, but their best savings are only on 3 numbers.
This one is so you.
While Unitel offers you their best savings on every number you call, anytime, anywhere in Canada and the U.S. Because Unitel saves you 25% on top of the other guy's regular rates, and even 25% on top of their evening and weekend discounted rates.
They all come in 3 shades of black.
Oh!
You wouldn't settle for the best savings on only 3 of anything. So call Unitel now at 1-800-958-4000 and save on every call.
I'd like a bottle of Otravin, please.
The city.
Huge impact on Montreal.
The stories.
Christina Lawand, Beaconsfield.
Wherever there's news, there's Newswatch. Newswatch with Dennis Truman. What Montreal is all about.
I don't think she's ready.
For what?
For Charlie. They've done nothing but fight since she got here.
Clean it up. She's earned it. Don't take it away from her. It's going to be different this time.
There's a fire!
North of 60, tonight at 9.
It's National Lobster Month at Red Lobster. Come in now for 7 great lobster dinners, all at special prices.
If you're looking for lobster, this is the place.
Hurry to National Lobster Month, now at Red Lobster Canada.
Behind the scenes, ahead of its time. Venture for the best stories from the world of business. Sunday evenings on CBC.
Lake Minnewanka, Banff National Park.
So you guys have any luck today?
Yeah, I got one here on the stringer. And
The fishing season has started, and the park wardens are out checking licenses. They've been in charge in the park for 100 years.
3 pounds. So,
They've been moving grizzly bears, policing trails and campsites, fighting forest fires. Parks Canada was set up to protect the parks, but until recently, that's meant protecting people and property from nature, from mountains, fires, and wild animals, particularly those competing with human hunters. Feisty bull elk in Banff town site have their antlers removed in the rutting season, even now. These ad hoc management policies have created a huge population of elk. With few predators left, they've multiplied rapidly. And unlike carnivores, they've adapted to living with humans. They're the outward sign of a natural system that's been deeply disrupted. For the past few centuries, we've imagined the natural world to be a place like this, a room full of things, objects to be classified, studied, rearranged. That's the worldview that created the national park system, as well as this museum where its treasures are displayed. The problem is, nature just isn't like that. It's a living, dynamic system that responds to stimulus and stress. And we're part of it. When we visit parks in such numbers, we destroy the places and the lives we set aside to protect. Stopping the process and starting to reverse the damage will take a very different kind of thinking. It means getting out of the museum and into a real world of growth and change. It's a place of infinitely complex relationships. Touch one part and the whole web changes. This is more than a grove of young aspen trees. It's the visible part of an enormous organism that may be 1,000 years old. Each aspen organism spreads underground across hectares of land, pushing up hundreds, perhaps thousands of identical clones to gather the sun's energy for growth. You can see the family likeness. In this particular grove, every tree grows branches at a right angle from the trunk. In this family, the branches slant on every clone. Aspens provide shelter and food for many animals in Banff National Park. But the web of relationships is shifting here, and sometime soon the aspen may vanish, like the bear that left its claw prints on this trunk. Elk browse on the young aspen clones as they always have. But today, there are many more elk, and there are fewer aspen. Once the young clones are eaten, the elk chew the bark, and the older clones weaken and die. The disruption doesn't end there. These days, it's hard to know what's natural and what's the result of human manipulation here. Aspen regenerates quickly in disturbed ground. It's the first to reappear after a fire.
but fire has been suppressed here for almost a century by human firefighters. Conifers are invading aspen territory and taking it over.
If all this is true, the question is, what should we do? Should some of the elk be killed or moved somewhere else? Or should they be fed like animals in a zoo? Or should nature take its course, even if it means the aspen disappear? Whatever happens, the species that disrupted the system is still fiddling with it, trying to fix it.
There's a new kind of warden in the park. The ecosystem group of warden biologists is studying the complex changes happening here. Tom Hurd.
We wanted to look at moose in the lower Bow Valley, throughout the Bow Valley actually, because we were a little bit concerned about their low abundance relative to previous years. They were one of the dominant ungulates in the system. They're largely absent now, and one of our concerns is that the reasons for their absence are not natural fluctuations. Perhaps we had something to do with it. We are starting to put the picture together a little bit better than we had in the past.
The snails are part of the picture. They carry a liver fluke, a parasite that's fatal to moose. The fluke comes from the elk, who don't usually die from it, and who are moving into moose habitat in the Bow Valley. Moose die on the road and the railway, but they're also victims of the elk's success. Warden Charlie Packus is working on the park's aquatic life, trying to solve the problems caused by a century of management promoting sport fishing.
We've got a lot of fishing restrictions that we've put in place this year, and we see that as being the first step. That's going to limit a lot of the pressure on our native stocks. We're also trying to find out where our fish are, our numbers, and I guess that's when we started seeing some scary things.
Park wildlife is in disarray underwater as well as on land. Species introduced for fishers have devastated the food chain in some of these mountain lakes and rivers, threatening native species. Charlie Packus hopes to restore native aquatic life here in Banff, but fishing is a major source of tourist dollars. Doing the studies is one thing, setting the policy another. Radio callers are part of this quest for understanding. Large carnivores are being studied these days instead of being shot to find out what to do about their decline. Slowly, they're getting protection from visitors. To keep wolves undisturbed in their den site last year, wardens closed a campground and moved more than 2,000 people. Warden Cliff White heads the new ecosystem group of biologist wardens. He says management policy in national parks has started to acknowledge the impact of human beings on nature.
Taking an ecosystem analysis, we now recognize that even if we pretend to ourselves that we're doing nothing inside these parks, of course we're doing many things. We're adding millions of people. We're suppressing fires all within the parks. Landscape changes all around the parks have changed the flux of animal populations inside and outside the parks.
Cliff White's group is now setting fires instead of fighting them. It's part of a new approach called ecosystem management. We've learned to think of fire as a deadly enemy, but in fact, it's an agent of change and renewal in the dry northern forest. This fire, of course, isn't a natural event. It's an attempt to mimic one. At the University of Calgary, carnivore specialist Stephen Herrero.
One of the big challenges that we've had genuine trouble in coming to grips with in parks like Banff and ultimately in all parks is allowing them to basically be shaped by natural processes. There's a raging debate on currently whether the park should be designed by the hands of man and management levels set for certain wildlife species, or whether nature and natural processes should set the character of the habitat and the species should fall in around that. In Banff Park, fire has been the great designer of our park landscapes. When fire has been suppressed, areas typically become unproductive for species like grizzly bear that are somewhat a fire successional species. One of the greatest challenges we face is either letting natural fire burn or being able to effectively mimic the outcome of natural fire.
It certainly is a challenge. Scientists argue about methods and intensity. Some tourism operators claim it ruins business. Visitors may complain about the smoke. The risks are huge, the unknowns endless. Is this really the way back to the wild? Life seizes its opportunity, picking its way through the ashes. But was the fire made for the mule deer, or are humans still the priority here?
We can formulate management objectives, set out thresholds by which we say that we think that so much fire is required, so much predation is required, so many animals are required in this area. And then we can try to manage for those. And by setting up those targets, we can then, in essence, we've said, well, this is how the ecosystem, or what the ecosystem needs to run. And then we can balance that against the business plans and the development plans, et cetera, that human beings have in terms of trying to maintain economic viability in our community and return the social goals that are desirable in parks for the other half of our mandate.
Mike McIver of the Bow Valley Naturalists thinks science is being used to push the same human agenda.
There is a tendency on the part of all humans, I guess, but certainly on the part of some park managers and people who work in parks, to want to control the ecosystem, to want to manage it, to dominate it, to make it conform to our desires, to make it behave. And I think, particularly in a national park, that is fundamentally wrong. And when we start manipulating the ecosystem to make it stack up to some preconceived idea as to how it should perform, I think is wrong, and that kind of work should not be done. We know what we need to know. Natural systems need space and time to function, and we need to give those things to them.
The former federal minister, Michel Dupuis, seemed to agree. In 1994, he imposed a moratorium on development in the Bow Valley. Then, he ordered a study of the environmental impact of all human activities here. I asked Mr. Dupuis about this unprecedented step.
What were the factors that led to the establishment of the Bow Valley study?
I became convinced that if we were to preserve forever the beauty of that land, we had to move into a more sophisticated way of looking at things. Hence this Bow Valley study, which is going to look at the cumulative effect of what has been done in the past and what may be done in the future.
The trouble is, several major developments were excluded from the moratorium and the study. The expansion of Sunshine Ski Resort continues after clearing a court challenge from environmentalists. The forest has already been cut for the new ski runs. The park's biggest business has also been exempted. Canadian Pacific wants to expand the golf course at Banff Springs Hotel on 26 hectares of montane land, critical wildlife habitat. And they want to add 250 more rooms to the hotel. At Lake Louise, CP wants to build a conference center, like the one at Banff Springs, to bring more business meetings to the wilderness. The Trans-Canada Highway running along the Bow Valley causes great harm to animals and people. Now it's proposed to divide and fence the highway right across the park, cutting the place in two. Can the protection of the Bow Valley be studied without including these projects.
We've got to balance the protection of the environment against sustainable development of the parks. It's always a balance, and that is the main challenge.
We should begin the process of de-development, of real genuine regulation of what goes on inside this most developed of all national parks in North America. For Canadians to say, this is not the way we want to experience nature with a fur coat slung on our shoulders after 9 holes of golf or 18 or 27.
What happens in Banff will have implications not only for other parks in the Canadian National Park system. I think it has implications for the planet. If we can't sort out some sort of reasonable, harmonious relationship between human beings and the rest of the world in Banff National Park, where the hell are we going to do it?
After the break, restoring parks to their natural state.
Everybody has questions. Can a bank help?
Dear men, please don't be fooled by all the heart-shaped boxes of candy out there for Valentine's Day. There's really only one, Russell Stover, with the incredibly rich blend of 3 kinds of chocolate that nobody can do quite like Russell Stover. It's not just the box, it's what's inside your heart that matters. Nobody does chocolate like Russell Stover does chocolate.
The Montreal Association for the Blind, serving Quebec since 1908, offering essential services to people of all ages. A residential school, infant programs, rehabilitation for the young, residential care for the aged, and a low-vision clinic. Now, during our financial campaign, we ask you to please give generously. The Montreal Association for the Blind, teaching people who can't see to live, grow, and succeed in a world that does. We see what the blind can do.
Just shut it up!
You think I need this? I don't need this. I don't need this. No, Dad, please!
Daddy wouldn't do anything to hurt you.
Dear Father, will you?
As long as you live here, you'll do as I say!
Please, just leave me alone. Oh, yeah? Get out there. Get out. I can't stand you anymore either. Get out!
Get out! Get out!
There are 5,000 young people stranded on our streets, most often by no fault of their own. Please help us help the kids.
Scotland, a country whose rugged beauty has always bred strength of character and trustworthy counsel. No surprise, it also gave birth to Standard Life, Canada's only major financial institution to have earned Moody's and Standard & Poor's AAA rating. Such are the rewards of exceptional discipline, financial stability, and performance. Standard Life.
Live from Orlando, it's SeaWorld! Hey, let's go see the Cubs first.
Ooh, you almost got one.
Look, it's easy.
Mr. Olympic.
Simulator ride. Meanwhile, just pick one.
Whoa, ooh, nice lunch.
Prepare yourself for a bad hair day.
I'm soaked. Yikes! Look, she's eating Shamu.
Oh, great day, huh? SeaWorld of Florida. Let the adventure begin.
Things are changing in national parks. This is the West Coast Trail in Pacific Rim National Park, a rugged hike through the rainforest on the coast of Vancouver Island. It's one of the world's great trails, and it's extremely popular, as I discovered at the trailhead office last summer. Heather Brooke was the information officer on duty.
Can I get a permit to go on the trail?
Well, I'm sorry, but we're full today, and we do have a few spots available tomorrow. We have a quota system.
Oh, I see. So why have we got the reservation system?
We had so many complaints because of overcrowding, too much garbage, human waste in campsites. The complaints were overwhelming, and so what we did was we had a visitor survey, and hikers decided that they wanted to see a quota system in place here.
Do you think by limiting access, it actually helps the wilderness area as well?
This year we've had more bear and cougar sightings especially than in the last recent years that I've been here.
Many hikers book and pay the fee months ahead. Some chance it, camping on the beach in hopes that someone won't show up. There's a strict limit to numbers allowed on the trail every day.
This is the obvious first step, limiting access to parks or to places in the parks that are under pressure. It doesn't seem easy to do, but there's no point in letting a park be loved to death. And the people on this trail seem to agree with the idea. But it's just a beginning, a way to buy time while we work out what else to do. The problems are enormously complex, and where there are solutions, they're expensive or controversial or both.
Point Peely's sandy peninsula, trailing south into Lake Erie, is renowned among bird watchers around the world. Millions of birds stop over here on their annual migrations, and thousands of people come to see them. It's the second smallest national park, just 15 square kilometers in one of Canada's most populated regions.
There has to be a God.
Peely is part of the Carolinian Zone, a region of extraordinary diversity in plants and animals, including a wetland of international significance. Recreation, hunting, and development have taken their toll here, and any wilderness that's left ends abruptly at the park boundary. But there's a vigorous program to restore and protect this unique place. Acting Superintendent Lily Mellig.
At one point, certainly the philosophy of national parks wasn't what it is today, and there was a great deal of development in this park. There was a large cottage industry here. We had, I think, probably 300 cottages at one time. There were stores here. There was a post office, a school. So all of that has had a major impact on what is a very fragile and small ecosystem. So I would think that since the late 60s, the 70s, park management has been trying to come to terms with the impacts that all of the development and the users have had on the park, and we've been working very diligently to restore the park to a healthy ecosystem.
Just 3 cottages remain, and their days are numbered. The Carolinian forest regains a few crucial square meters. Half a million visitors pour into Peely each year. Instead of driving to the point, they're ferried here by transit train. Access roads and parking lots have been torn up and restored to the wild. Restoration hasn't always gone smoothly. 30 years ago, park managers planted a non-native tree species by mistake. It turned into a scourge. It spread quickly, overgrowing most things in its path. Thousands of saplings have had to be removed to make room for the diversity of native vegetation. Park naturalist Tom Hintz.
I don't think we have all the answers, and if somebody tells you that they do have all the answers, I think they just are fooling you. I think we have to be very realistic with people. I think we have to tell them in a straightforward way that we're learning as we go along. It took millions of years to create this incredibly complex environment that we have. to think that we could recreate, restore, or perhaps somehow remanufacture it in a very short period of time in a completely interwoven set of relationships is absolutely naive.
Even the biggest parks have problems. Wood Buffalo National Park is as big as Switzerland, yet this remote northern wilderness is threatened. Wetlands used by almost 500,000 waterfowl have started drying up since the Bennett Dam was built in British Columbia. Kevin McNamee is from the Canadian Nature Federation.
I think we haven't done a good job in communicating to people the level of threats to our existing national parks. And part of the problem, I believe, is because politicians simply don't believe it. Logging, mining, agricultural development, all of these are encroaching on park boundaries to the point where sometimes, like in Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba, you can actually see the park boundaries from the air because they've been clear-cut right up to the boundary. And all of this relates to a lack of political support for the objectives of national parks.
Parks are supposed to protect the wild, but parks have boundaries, and just beyond them, the wild is threatened. Perhaps parks just aren't enough. Stephen Herrero.
Parks definitely aren't enough to ensure that we'll have wildlife. Take the case of the grizzly bear and the wolf. They don't see those park boundaries out there. The typical grizzly bear in this area may enter 4 different jurisdictions in a year. They go from ranch lands into oil and gas lands, into provincial park lands, into recreation lands, into Banff National Park lands. They don't know where they're protected and where they aren't. So it's obvious that parks aren't enough.
Stephen Herrero has put together a working group that extends beyond the parks to protect the grizzly across the Central Rocky Mountains.
It's the first time that the federal government, through Parks Canada, the provincial government, through its Fish and Wildlife Agency, the ranching industry, the oil and gas industry, the development industry, and academics have all come together, not because they were told to come together, but because they wanted to, around a common interest, trying to identify what's needed for the future of the grizzly bear in our area. And I can't help find significant hope in the commitment of all those agencies and individuals to the common future of the grizzly bear in our region.
But we've got a long ways to go, and I think the government recognizes that, but it gets back to the education
Meeting with
issue
conservation specialists in Toronto, I learned just how incomplete our national park system is.
You know, I don't think I've ever been as shocked as when I first saw the map of Canada's national parks. These tiny little green spots are what we leave. First of all, is that enough?
The national parks, which is what we're looking at here, account for only about 2% of the area of the country. So the answer to your question about is it enough, it's not by any standard.
So what should we have for a wildland strategy that would satisfy this group here at the table?
We need at least an example of all the different kinds of ecosystems we have in Canada. That's what the Endangered Spaces Campaign sets out as an absolute minimum in terms of a total conservation system.
Just to give you a sense of what the science is telling us, there was a wolf that was tagged right along the U.S. border, traveled all the way up through the Rockies in one season, and was found later up here in Dawson Creek, mile 0 of the Alaska Highway. So what this means is that we have to establish natural highways and connective corridors along with core representative areas to protect the natural fabric and the web of life throughout North America.
But I see a real problem here, and that is that, Monty, you've drawn on massive areas. Kevin's drawn a huge circle like this, and you now talk, Mary, about this kind of corridor. But the fact is, we've tended to make little islands. How do we make your vision a reality?
We have to think about cooperation across the whole landscape. And unfortunately, what we're not doing is we're not identifying what we must protect first before allocating to development. And that's a fundamental principle that we have to apply to our landscape. Protect what we need first, and then let's talk about development.
I think in the short term, we can get the network of protected areas, the core areas. It's going to take a much longer time, conceivably hundreds of years, to link these. And it's not going to be always by expropriating land and making it a park. We have landowners cooperating on a voluntary basis who want to be part of this process. We have industries who are cooperating who want to be part of this process.
It's an enormous task, reimagining the landscape we inhabit. If we value wildlife, we'll redesign the way we use the land to accommodate the other animals that share it with us. If we don't, they'll disappear. National parks can be the core of a network of wild land across the continent. The work begins with defending and repairing the parks we have, creating the new parks we need. The federal government has promised 16 new national parks by the year 2000. They'll follow through when we let them know it's what we want.
For more information about parks, have a paper and pencil handy after the break.